A freezing night. 68-year-old Sydney huddled over an exhaust, great shielding her 4 children from the biting wind. She had exactly $3 to her name. She didn't know it yet, but a crumbling, rat-infested motel she was about to inherit held a staggering $200 million secret that would change everything. The Seattle rain didn't just fall. It drove itself into the pavement like cold, relentless nails. Inside a rusted 1998 Ford Econoline van, parked beneath the flickering amber light of a broken street lamp, Sydney Higgins rubbed her severely arthritic hands together, trying to generate a fraction of warmth. At 68 years old, Sydney was not meant to be living in a vehicle. She was not meant to be raising 4 children, her late sister Eleanor's kids, whom she had legally adopted after a tragic car accident claimed their parents' lives 5 years ago. But life, as Sydney had learned, rarely cared about what was meant to be. In the back of the van, 17-year-old Jackson sat wrapped in a moth-eaten sleeping bag, squinting at a worn biology textbook under the glow of a dying flashlight. Beside him, 15-year-old Tyler and 14-year-old Micah were huddled together for body heat, while 10-year-old Harper slept fitfully, her small head resting on Sydney's lap. Harper had a mild fever, and the 3 crumpled dollar bills in Sydney's pocket wouldn't even buy a bottle of children's ibuprofen. They had lost their apartment 8 months ago, when Sydney's meager pension was swallowed entirely by medical debts and skyrocketing rent. Since then, they had been ghosts shuffling between overcrowded shelters and this freezing metal box. A sharp, sudden knock on the driver's side window made Sydney jump. Harper stirred, whimpering in her sleep. Sydney cautiously rolled down the window an inch. A man in a tailored charcoal overcoat stood outside, holding an expensive umbrella that shielded him from the downpour. He looked entirely out of place in the desolate industrial park. "Sydney Higgins?" the man asked, his voice clipped and devoid of empathy. "Who's asking?" Sydney replied, her protective instincts immediately flaring. "My name is Mitchell. I'm a private investigator retained by the law firm of Finch, Abernathy and Hayes," he said, slipping a thick, cream-colored card through the crack in the window. "Your father, Harrison Caldwell, passed away 3 days ago. You are required to attend the reading of his will tomorrow morning at 9 sharp." Sydney stared at the card, her heart skipping a heavy beat. Harrison Caldwell. The name felt like a mouthful of ash. He was a ruthless real estate tycoon who had amassed a fortune by buying up distressed properties and evicting vulnerable tenants. Sydney had walked away from him and his blood money 42 years ago, choosing instead a life as a public school teacher. When Harrison demanded she abandon her pathetic bleeding heart charity work to join his empire, Sydney had refused. He had told her she was dead to him, and they had not spoken a single word since. "I don't want anything from him," Sydney whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of old grief and fresh anger. "With all due respect, Mrs. Higgins, it is not a request," Mitchell replied coldly. "There are legal formalities, and frankly, given your current living situation, I would strongly advise you to attend." The next morning, Sydney instructed Jackson to lock the van from the inside and keep his siblings quiet while she walked the 3 miles to the downtown financial district. She wore her only clean dress, a faded floral print, and a thin cardigan that did nothing to hide her shivering. The offices of Finch, Abernathy and Hayes occupied the entire top floor of a glass skyscraper. The mahogany paneling and plush carpets felt alien to Sydney's worn-out shoes. She was ushered into a sprawling conference room with a panoramic view of the Seattle skyline. At the head of the long table sat Attorney Gregory Finch, a slick, sharp-featured man whose forced smile did not reach his predatory eyes. "Sydney, so glad you could make it," Finch said smoothly, though his eyes briefly darted toward the frayed cuffs of her sweater. He didn't offer her a beverage. He merely opened a thick, leather-bound folder. "Let's get straight to business. Your father's estate is valued at roughly $450 million. Finch began adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. Sydney's breath hitched. She didn't want his money, but the sudden thought of a warm bed for Harper, college tuition for Jackson, and a safe home for all of them crashed over her like a tidal wave. Finch cleared his throat and began reading from the official document. I, Harrison Caldwell, being of sound mind, do hereby declare. The legal jargon dragged on for several minutes. Finch detailed massive donations to elite universities, trust funds established for Harrison's much younger third wife, Penelope, and millions allocated to the maintenance of his private yachts. Then Finch paused. He looked up at Sidney, a glimmer of cruel amusement dancing in his eyes. To my only biological daughter, Sidney, Finch read, his voice amplifying the silence in the room, who so self-righteously rejected my life's work to wallow with the impoverished, I leave a fitting inheritance. I bequeath to her the entirety of the Whispering Pines Motel in Oak Haven, Idaho. May she find comfort in the squalor she so desperately sought. Sidney sat frozen. A motel? Finch closed the folder with a sharp snap. Yes. The Whispering Pines. It has been abandoned for 22 years. It is currently condemned by the county. The roof has caved in, there is severe black mold, and the local government is threatening to fine the owner $50,000 if it is not demolished by the end of the month. He slid a pen across the mahogany table. It's a worthless liability, Sidney, a cruel joke from a cruel man. However, to save you the financial ruin of demolition fees, I have prepared a quitclaim deed. Sign the property over to a shell company managed by this firm, and we will handle the bulldozing. You can walk out of here and wash your hands of your father forever. Sidney looked down at the pen. Her father had hated her so much that he had reached beyond the grave to hand her a debt she could never repay. But as she reached for the pen, a lifetime of surviving on her own instincts kicked in. Why would Finch, a man who billed thousands of dollars an hour, be so eager to absorb a demolition cost for a homeless woman? No, Sidney said quietly. Finch's fake smile faltered. I beg your pardon. I said no, Sidney repeated, standing up and snatching the original deed from the table. My father gave it to me. I'm keeping it. Sidney, you are being irrational, Finch snapped, his voice rising in panic. You are living in a van. You cannot afford the liability. Then I'll live in the motel, she replied, turning her back on him. As she walked out of the opulent office, she didn't know how she was going to get her family to Idaho, but she knew one thing for certain. She was not going to let these men dictate her fate anymore. It took them 3 agonizing days to drive from Seattle to Oak Haven, Idaho. The old Ford Econoline wheezed and violently shuddered over the mountainous passes, requiring Sidney to pull over every 50 miles to pour water into the boiling radiator. They survived on day-old bread and cheap peanut butter, fueled entirely by the desperate hope that at the very least they would have 4 walls and a roof. Oak Haven was a forgotten logging town that time had left behind. When they finally turned off the cracked, weed-choked asphalt of County Road 9, the reality of Sidney's inheritance loomed into view. The Whispering Pines Motel was a waking nightmare. It was a sprawling, U-shaped mid-century motor lodge that had been completely surrendered to nature. Thick vines of ivy crawled up the rotting cedar siding, pulling down the rain gutters. Half of the windows were shattered, gaping like hollow black eyes. The main office door hung off a single rusted hinge, and the neon sign out front was missing half its letters, reading only WISPINGPIES. Aunt Maggie, Micah whispered from the back seat, her voice tight with unshed tears. We can't live here. It's scary. Sidney gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Her heart sank into her stomach. Finch had been right. It was squalor. It was a punishment. We just need to find one dry room, Sidney said, forcing a brave tone she didn't feel. Just one room to clean up. It's better than the van, kids. We can stand up. We can stretch out. Armed with a tire iron and a broom they had brought from Seattle, Jackson led the way. They kicked through knee-high weeds and debris, bypassing rooms where the ceilings had completely collapsed, exposing the gray Idaho sky. Finally, near the back of the property, behind the manager's office, they found room 12. It was small, dust and smelled strongly of mildew, but the roof was intact and the door still closed. They spent the afternoon sweeping out dead leaves and laying their sleeping bags on the faded, stained carpet. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Without electricity or running water, the darkness inside the motel was absolute and suffocating. Suddenly, Sydney's cheap prepaid cell phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a miracle she even had a signal. The caller ID flashed Gregory Finch. She answered cautiously. "Hello?" "Sydney, thank God I reached you." Finch's voice came through the static, sounding breathless and urgent. "Listen to me. I've been doing some negotiating on your behalf. I feel terrible about how your father treated you. I found a private buyer willing to take the land off your hands. They want to build a storage facility. They are willing to pay you $10,000 cash tomorrow morning." Sydney frowned in the darkness. $10,000. It was enough to get them an apartment back in Seattle, to buy groceries, to fix the van. It was a lifeline. But Finch's voice was too tight, too desperate. "I thought you said the demolition fees were $50,000. Sydney replied slowly. "Why would a buyer pay me 10 grand plus 50 grand in demolition for a lot in a ghost town? It's a tax write-off for them, Sydney. You don't understand high finance," Finch said, a subtle edge of condescension creeping back into his tone. "Don't be a fool. I can be there at 8 a.m. with the paperwork and a cashier's check. Just say yes. I'll think about it." Sydney lied and hung up the phone. She turned on her dying flashlight, her mind racing. Her father was a vindictive man, but he was also a calculated genius when it came to wealth. He never held on to a useless asset. If he had kept the Whispering Pines Motel for 22 years, paying the property taxes while it rotted to the ground, it meant something. "Jackson," Sydney whispered, shaking the teenager awake. "Bring the tire iron." Guided by the weak beam of the flashlight, Sydney and Jackson crept out of room 12 and made their way to the main manager's office. The room was a disaster zone of flipped filing cabinets, water-damaged drywall, and shredded linoleum. "What are we looking for?" Jackson asked, his breath misting in the freezing air. "I don't know," Sydney admitted, "but Finch is coming tomorrow and he's terrified of what I might find." They began tearing through the debris. Sydney pried open rusted desk drawers while Jackson used the tire to flip over heavy pieces of fallen ceiling. For an hour they found nothing but rat droppings and rotted paper. Sydney's hope began to wane. Maybe she was just an old, desperate woman seeing conspiracies where there was only cruelty. "Aunt Maggie, look at this!" Jackson called out from the back wall of the office. Sydney hurried over. Jackson had pulled away a large, water-warped piece of wood paneling. Behind the paneling, the drywall was strangely different from the rest of the room. It wasn't crumbling. It was solid. Jackson swung the heavy tire iron against the wall. Instead of a dull thud, the impact rang out with a sharp, heavy metallic clang. Sydney gasped. She grabbed the tire iron and began smashing away the cheap plaster. Huge chunks fell to the floor, raising clouds of white dust. Beneath the facade of the rotting motel wall was a sheer panel of solid industrial-grade steel. They worked feverishly, tearing away more plaster until they uncovered the edges of a massive, heavily reinforced vault door embedded directly into the foundation of the building. It had a digital keypad, long dead, and a heavy mechanical keyhole. "What is this?" Jackson breathed, staring at the imposing steel barrier. "This isn't a motel," Sydney whispered, trailing her trembling fingers over the cold metal. "It's a vault." She shone her flashlight around the immediate area. Tucked into a narrow gap between the steel frame and the remaining drywall, Sydney spotted a small, dusty picture frame wrapped in plastic. She pulled it free and wiped away the grime. It, Clear's throat, was a photograph from 1965. A much younger Harrison Caldwell stood holding a little girl's hand in front of this very motel back when the neon sign shone brightly. The little girl was Sydney. With shaking hands, Sydney turned the frame over. Taped to the cardboard backing was a heavy brass safety deposit key and a small handwritten note in her father's unmistakable scrawl. "The world sees garbage. You always saw the soul. Look deeper, Maggie." Before Sydney could process the words, a blindingly bright light suddenly flooded the broken windows of the manager's office, casting long, terrifying shadows against the steel vault. The heavy, unmistakable rumble of diesel engines vibrated through the floorboards. Sydney rushed to the shattered window and peered out. 3 massive yellow bulldozers had just pulled into the motel parking lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Leading the convoy was a sleek black SUV. The door opened and Gregory Finch stepped out into the freezing Idaho night, accompanied by 2 large, imposing men carrying crowbars. Finch stared directly at the manager's office, a cruel sneer twisting his face. The demolition wasn't scheduled for the end of the month. Finch had come to bury the motel and the treasure inside it tonight. The violent roar of the diesel engines rattled the very floorboards beneath Sydney's worn shoes. The blinding glare from the bulldozer's headlights pierced through the shattered windows of the manager's office, casting monstrous, shifting shadows against the newly exposed steel vault. Sydney's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Finch hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to bury the Whispering Pines Motel into the dirt, effectively erasing both the hidden treasure and any trace of the family sleeping in room 12. Aunt Maggie. Jackson choked out his grip, tightening agonizingly around the heavy tire iron. They're going to tear the building down. Tyler and the girls are still in the back. Listen to me, Jackson, Sydney said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute icy calm. She didn't know she possessed. The panic was entirely gone, replaced by the fierce protective instinct of a mother cornered by predators. You're going to crawl out the back window, run to room 12, wake up your brother and sisters and get them into the tree line behind the property. Do not make a sound. Do you understand? You hide in the woods and you call 911 on my prepaid phone. I'm not leaving you here with them, or Jackson protested, his 17-year-old frame trembling with a mixture of terror and rising adrenaline. You are going to do exactly as I say, Sydney commanded, shoving the phone into his cold hands. Go. Now. Reluctantly, Jackson slipped through the rear window, his silhouette vanishing into the freezing Idaho night. Sydney took a deep, steadying breath. She clutched the heavy brass safety deposit key and her father's handwritten note tightly in her fist, shoving them deep into the pocket of her faded cardigan. Then she picked up the tire iron her nephew had left behind. She was a 68-year-old woman with severe arthritis, but she marched out of the manager's office and into the glaring headlights with the terrifying posture of a titan. "Turn those machines off!" Sydney screamed, her voice cutting through the mechanical roar like a cracking whip. Finch stood near the lead bulldozer, flanked by his 2 massive crowbar-wielding enforcers. He wore a tailored cashmere coat that mocked the bitter cold, his slick hair gleaming under the floodlights. Seeing Sydney step out of the ruined building, his cruel, manufactured smile vanished entirely, replaced by a mask of genuine, unadulterated malice. He raised a gloved hand, and the heavy machinery grumbled down to a low, idling purr. "Sydney!" Finch called out, stepping forward, his breath pluming in the icy air. "I must admit you are incredibly stubborn. I offered you $10,000 to walk away. You should have taken the money. Now you're trespassing on an active demolition site." "I hold the deed to this property, Finch," Sydney shouted back, gripping the tire iron tightly. "This isn't a demolition site, it's a crime scene, and if you take one more step, I swear to God I will make you regret it." Finch threw his head back and laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that chilled Sydney to the bone. "You hold a piece of paper, Sydney. A piece of paper that will burn beautifully once this rotted structure collapses. Do you honestly think I care about this moldy wood? Your father was a paranoid old fool. Before he died, he liquidated his most valuable international assets and hid the bearer bonds alongside deeds to rare earth mineral mines inside that vault." Finch took another step closer, his eyes locked onto her with a sickening greed. $200 million, Sydney. Untraceable. The legal accounts at J.P. Morgan Chase were strictly monitored by his new wife, Penelope, and the board of directors. But this was his private hoard. He meant to lock it away where Penelope couldn't reach it. He knew she was siphoning his accounts. He knew we were planning to legally declare him incompetent. Leaving this condemned property to you was his final spiteful move to hide the real wealth under the guise of an insult. "So you decided to murder a homeless family to get it," Sydney stated, her voice devoid of fear. vibrating only with disgust. "I decided to clean up a clerical error," Finch corrected coldly. He gestured to his two goons. "Remove the old woman from the premises. If she resists, accidents happen on construction sites every single day." The two massive men stepped forward, slapping their heavy crowbars against their gloved palms. Sydney didn't back down. She raised the iron bar, her joints screaming in pain. Preparing for a fight, she knew she could not physically win. Suddenly, the piercing shriek of police sirens shattered the quiet night. Red and blue lights exploded through the dense tree line, illuminating the cracked asphalt of County Road 9. 3 Oakhaven Sheriff's cruisers tore into the motel parking lot, tires screeching as they formed a barricade between the bulldozers and Sydney. Finch's face drained of all color. He spun around, frantically waving at the bulldozer operators, but it was too late. Officers poured out of the cruisers, weapons drawn and flashlights blinding the intruders. "Oakhaven Sheriff's Department, drop the weapons and step away from the machinery." A booming voice echoed through a megaphone. Jackson emerged from the shadows of the woods, his siblings huddled safely behind him, pointing a shaking finger at the attorney. "That's him. He brought the bulldozers. He tried to kill my aunt." The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of flashing lights, raised voices, and the clinking of steel handcuffs. Gregory Finch's arrogant facade completely crumbled as Sheriff Brody, a rugged man with a stern, deeply lined face, read him his rights. Finch babbled frantically, claiming he was an elite corporate attorney executing a lawful property order, but Sydney's presentation of the original signed deed silenced his frantic lies. The enforcers dropped their crowbars instantly, and the bulldozer drivers, realizing they had been hired for an illegal midnight demolition, eagerly surrendered their keys. Sydney stood shivering by a police cruiser, a thick woolen blanket draped over her frail shoulders. Harper clung tightly to her waist, burying her face in Sydney's faded cardigan, while Jackson, Tyler, and Micah stood close, their eyes wide with shock and awe. They had survived the night. "Ma'am," Sheriff Brody said, approaching Sydney with a steaming cup of awful gas station coffee. "Your nephew told us a wild story on the phone about a vault and an assassination plot. Now, I've driven past the Whispering Pines for 30 years, and it's always just been a raccoon hotel to me." Sydney took the coffee with trembling hands. "Sheriff, if you have a team that can open a bank vault, I highly recommend you call them." By dawn, the motel parking lot was swarming with state investigators, heavily armed deputies, and a specialized tactical locksmith team brought in from Boise. Sydney and her children watched from the safety of the sheriff's mobile command center as the locksmiths drilled into the reinforced steel door hidden within the manager's office. At exactly 8:14 a.m., a loud metallic clack echoed across the property. The heavy vault door swung open with a slow, grinding groan revealing the pitch-black interior. Armed deputies entered first, their flashlights sweeping the space. Moments later, the lead investigator emerged, his face completely pale, looking as though he had just witnessed a ghost. "Mrs. Higgins," the investigator called out, his voice cracking slightly. "You need to see this." Sydney, flanked by Jackson and the sheriff, slowly walked into the ruined office and stepped through the massive steel threshold. The vault was the size of a master bedroom, fully climate-controlled and immaculate, a stark contrast to the rotting wood outside. Inside, stacked on heavy reinforced shelving, were rows upon rows of gleaming gold bullion catching the beams of the flashlights like captured sunlight. Beside the gold sat dozens of thick, waterproof lockboxes. The investigators had opened one, revealing stacks of pristine unregistered bearer bonds and certified land deeds to highly lucrative rare earth mineral mines across South America. But what caught Sydney's eye was not the staggering, unfathomable wealth. It was a single mahogany desk sitting in the center of the vault. Resting on the polished wood was a pristine white envelope with her name written on it. She approached the desk, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized her father's handwriting immediately. With shaking hands, she broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick parchment. "My dearest Sydney, if you are reading this, it means I am dead, and you were exactly the woman I always knew you were. You were the only one with the grit, the stubbornness, and the fierce independence to look past the ugly surface of things. I was a cruel man, Maggie. I chased money until my soul was entirely bankrupt. I surrounded myself with vipers as like Penelope and Finch, people who loved my bank accounts but despised my breathing. When I realized they were slowly poisoning my medication to trigger a heart attack and seize my empire, I knew I had to act. I couldn't trust the banks. I couldn't trust the lawyers. But I knew I could trust my daughter's resilient spirit. I left you the Whispering Pines because I knew the vipers would mock it, ignore it, and dismiss it as a final insult. But I also knew you. I knew that if I gave you a piece of dirt, you would try to build a home on it. I left you the real legacy. $200 million in untraceable liquid assets. Build a better life than I did. Forgive an old fool. Love, Dad. Tears spilled over Sydney's weathered cheeks, dropping silently onto the letter. The bitterness, and that had calcified in her heart for 42 years, began to slowly crack, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sorrow and an undeniable sense of peace. He had loved her in his own broken, twisted way. He had saved her. Within a month, the nightmare of the rusted Ford Econoline van was nothing but a distant memory. The legal proceedings were swift. Finch and Penelope were indicted on federal charges of conspiracy fraud and attempted murder. Their lavish lives traded for cold concrete cells. Sydney didn't buy a mansion, nor did she buy a fleet of yachts. Instead, she purchased a sprawling, beautiful ranch in the rolling green hills of Idaho. Jackson enrolled in a prestigious pre-med program, his biology textbook replaced by state-of-the-art equipment. Tyler and Micah attended excellent schools, and little Harper finally had a warm, bright bedroom filled with more toys than she could ever play with. Sydney Higgins, the homeless single mother of 4 who had once huddled over a freezing exhaust grate, used the rest of the J.P. Morgan Chase verified funds to establish the Caldwell Foundation. She built shelters, funded free medical clinics, and bought up distressed properties not to evict tenants like her father had once done, but to renovate them and provide affordable housing for families who had nothing. The Caldwell Foundation quickly became a monumental force for good across the Pacific Northwest. Sydney hired a team of dedicated social workers, financial advisors, and housing advocates. They scoured the cities for people living just like she once had forgotten in rusted vehicles, huddled in the freezing dampness of alleys and crushed beneath the weight of an uncaring system. She built specialized transition homes that offered not just a temporary roof, but comprehensive job training, psychological counseling, and free childcare. She named the very first flagship shelter the Whispering Pines, turning a symbol of decay into a sanctuary of absolute renewal. Harper's fever never returned. Jackson graduated at the top of his university class. Micah discovered a profound passion for architecture sketching designs for low-income housing that her aunt would later fund and build. Tyler found his calling in culinary arts, eventually opening a community kitchen that fed thousands of struggling individuals a week. They were a family forged in the bitter cold, now radiating immense warmth. Sydney often walked the grounds of her expansive, sunlit ranch, feeling the soft grass beneath her feet. The arthritis that once crippled her hands was expertly managed by world-class doctors. Her heart, once heavy with betrayal, was completely light. She had broken the cycle of greed, discovering that true wealth was never locked inside a dark steel vault, but found in the unyielding strength to protect the ones you love. If Sydney's incredible journey from a freezing van to a $200 million empire inspired you, please hit that like button. Share this video with friends to remind them that true wealth lies in kindness, resilience, and never giving up hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another jaw-dropping, true-to-life story of stunning twists and ultimate redemption.